Hello. Today's lecture is going to cover another of the thinking skills that you should develop in college. We're going to talk about analyzing today, and I will connect analysis to exam essay questions, but I'm going to hopefully convince you that analysis is relevant in much more than just writing short answer questions. I want to start by conveying to you what it actually means to analyze. Then I hope to help you understand why it's important for you to learn how to analyze, both for your eventual career and for your personal life. And then finally, I'm going to give you a real-life example that I have found very personally meaningful to analyze to hopefully give you some ideas of things that you yourself want to analyze. Let's start, though, with a definition. This is the definition of analyze that I shared way back at the beginning of the semester. One way that we can think of analysis is to break something down into its constituent parts, to figure out how those parts are related to one another, and how those parts are related to the idea as a whole. One way to see what I mean by this definition is thinking about the difference between anatomy and physiology. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but it does help us understand what analysis means. Anatomy is learning the body parts, right? Just remembering what the body parts are, where they are, perhaps what they do. Physiology, on the other hand, is relating those body parts together. So instead of studying what the heart is and where it is, you might study the cardiovascular system, the relationship between those body parts. What we are doing when we analyze is we are discovering how one concept is related to another concept, right? So in physiology, you're studying how the heart is related to other parts of the cardiovascular system, as opposed to just those parts in isolation. This is a complicated idea, so one final way to think about analysis or analyzing is analyzing is like understanding embedded in a rich, meaningful context. Right, so think about that pyramid that I presented to you at the beginning of the class. We have remembering and understanding as the two foundational levels of that pyramid. So in that image, understanding an idea in isolation is great, right? But if we can understand that idea in context, in relation to other ideas in the subject, that would be a component of analysis, right? So how does that concept relate to other concepts? How does it fit into some overall organizational scheme? That's all analysis. Oh, right, I just said this, so right, as opposed to the understanding of some fact in isolation. All right, so how important is analysis? If I didn't include this part of the lecture, you might come away with the idea that analysis is less important than the other thinking skills, right? Because for application, you got a whole lecture on applying and you're doing a project. You're going to get a whole lecture for evaluation and you're doing a project. And finally, you'll get a whole lecture on creativity and you'll get a project where you practice creativity. For analysis, you don't have a project dedicated to it. You only get this lecture. But I don't want you to come away from that reality thinking that I don't care as much about analysis. It's more like this concept is so important and relevant in so many different places that I didn't want to pin it down and say, okay, this right here, this is the only place that you're doing analysis. You're actually doing analysis all over the place. So to give you some ideas of where analyzing becomes important or even essential, here are some skills. complex problem solving, critical thinking, along with evaluation, digital literacy, communication skills, right? I'll say a few more words about some of the things you see on this list here. When you engage in complex problem solving, you're going to break the problem down into pieces, try to figure out what the actual obstacles are, and relate the solution that you come up with to each of those pieces, right? Critical thinking has two sub-skills. One of them is analyzing the problem, just like in complex problem solving, and then you also have to evaluate whatever solution you have to evaluate whatever kind of thinking you are doing. Digital literacy, hopefully y'all know this, but digital literacy is not just Google it and take the first result that pops up. It's organizing information. Sometimes things that Google gives you are irrelevant to your question, so you need to figure out which is relevant, which is irrelevant, and just like with critical thinking, you need evaluation. So is this actually a reliable search result? And then finally, communication skills, both written and oral communication skills, you need analysis. You need to have some kind of organizational flow. You need to know how one idea connects to another in your communication, etc. Okay, so what are those numbers you see up there? Those numbers are the proportion of your future employers that judge it either somewhat or very important for you to have that skill, right? So overwhelmingly, your future employers want you to be able to analyze. Also, importantly, fewer than half, sometimes a lot less than half of your future employers say that they have trouble finding people with these skills. So these skills are skills that your competitors are developing. So you need to develop these skills if you want to be competitive on the job market. One quick thing to realize here is I just want to point this out because I don't want you to get confused about what analytical means. Sometimes when you see the term analytical in a job description, the employer actually means quantitative, right? So quantitative data analysis. That surely does use analysis, but the way that I am using this term, analyze or analysis, is more general than simply just quantitative data analysis. All right. Here's a long list of some non-specific examples of analyzing tasks. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but I'll point out a couple of them to you because I imagine you have already gotten some experience with analyzing in your previous experience in school and in your personal life, right? Identifying the main idea. In a workplace setting, you might imagine your boss gives you a white paper and says, all right, I don't have time to read this whole thing, but I want you to read it and tell me what the main points are, right? So summarizing the main idea of something is analysis. Another more everyday example of a place that you might do this would be, imagine you are trying to convince a friend of yours to watch a new TV show that you really like. You're not going to sit there and explain every single little plot point to your friend to convince them to watch. You're going to summarize the main idea, right? You're going to tell them the gist of what this show is about. You're breaking down that complex idea of the entire TV show into its parts and then identifying which of those parts are important. That's analysis. A couple other things that you're doing or that you might use analysis for, big in research, right? So identifying the independent variable in a study, how is that related to the dependent variable, experimental control groups, and all of this stuff that we need in order to have high confidence in some research, that all involves analysis. And then finally, that last thing you see on the bottom there, if you've ever gotten a compare and contrast essay prompt, that is absolutely something that uses analysis, right? So identifying similarities and differences requires you to break down a complex idea into pieces and then figure out how those pieces are related to one another. Are they similar or different? So now let's talk a little bit more about analysis, the concept. There are 3 key components of analysis. Whenever you analyze, you are engaging in comparison, you are finding connections, and you are looking for relationships. By the way, do you see what is going on here? To get a little bit meta for 1 second here, we are currently analyzing the concept of analysis. We're breaking it down into pieces, these 3 pieces. Now I'm going to go through each one of those at a time, relate them to one another, and relate them to analysis as a whole. Let's start with compare, and we're going to put compare and connect together because you really can't have one meaningfully without the other. So starting with comparing, here's some examples of comparisons that you might make, right? You might compare different articles on the same topic. Let's say you were interested in learning about effective treatments for depression. You might read one article and then compare that article to another one. You might also compare different parts of a chapter, right? So when you read the chapter on perception, you might compare bottom-up processing to top-down processing. You might also compare different chapters in a textbook. How do the research methods that you learn about in the neuroscience chapter compare to the research methods that you learned from Module 2? When you compare, you are generally trying to make some kind of connection. That's how these 2 ideas go together. The general thing that we're doing is connecting to something that we already know, right? So if you're reading 2 articles on effective treatments for depression, you gotta read one of them first. Congratulations, that is now something you already know, and you can compare the new article, the second one, to that first one that you read. What is it about the second half of chapter 3 that is connected to the first half of chapter 3, right? Is there more theoretical stuff at the beginning of the perception chapter and then more examples at the end? What is the nature of that connection? Now, different chapters within the same textbook here. At the end of the course, we're going to start talking about psychological disorders and therapeutic treatments. There's a reason why we're covering that at the end, and it's because in order to understand abnormal psychology, you really should be able to connect everything that you've learned from the beginning of the course to your understanding of psychological disorders, right? So connecting what we learned about learning and conditioning to psychological disorders, for example, might be some kind of analysis that you can do between different chapters of the textbook. Also, we might be connecting what we're reading or learning in class with other experiences, like, for example, your personal life. Turns out that the self-reference effect is actually an example of analysis. Importantly, however, there has to be a point. Whenever you do analysis, you need to have some overall meaningful structure that you are embedding these connections within. Otherwise, you might end up like one of my favorite TV elderly people, Grandpa Simpson.
We can't bust heads like we used to, but we have our ways.
Oh, you got it.
One trick is to tell them stories that don't go anywhere. Like the time I caught the ferry over to Shelbyville. I needed a new heel for my shoe. So I decided to go to Morganville, which is what they called Shelbyville in those days. So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry cost a nickel, and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 B's for a quarter, you'd say. Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. The important thing was that I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. They didn't have white onions because of the war. The only thing you could get was those big yellow ones.
right? So analysis is not just random. These connections need to have some kind of meaningful structure. That's a part of the definition of analysis. We got some complex concept, we're going to break it down into pieces, and we're going to connect those pieces to some kind of meaningful structure. Otherwise, you're going to be rambly and like dear old Grandpa Simpson. Now on to this third part, recognizing relationships. Largely what we do in analysis is we want to recognize relationships between concepts. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are some kinds of relationships that you might find in analysis. So for example, maybe we are reading about coping with stress, which is something you'll learn about in chapter 13 after the midterm. Within that overall concept of coping with stress, we might find hierarchies, right? So different levels of organization. Within the concept of coping with stress, we can break that down into two different types of coping with stress: emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. Emotion-focused coping is what you do when the coping strategy only deals with the bad emotions that you are feeling. So whatever strategy you're using to deal with that stress just makes you feel better. So it relieves depression, anxiety, fear, whatever those bad emotions are. Problem-focused coping, on the other hand, takes some steps to actually solve the source of the stress, right? So you can reframe a problem, you can learn a new skill, you can do something to address the root cause, the problem. We can also look for parts and wholes, right? So within the idea of emotion-focused coping, we can break this into parts. One part of emotion-focused coping would be the specific emotion that you're feeling: anger, anxiety, fear, sadness, right? Another part of that concept would be the thing that you are doing to relieve that bad emotion. So what action are you taking? And putting those two things together, we get that whole of emotion-focused coping. Examples and general principles. So I just gave you the general principles, the definitions for emotion-focused and problem-focused coping. Let me give you an example. So one thing that I like to do to deal with my negative emotions is I like to go for a run. So if I have a stressful day at work, I feel some anxiety, I can go for a run and that makes me feel better. That would be an example of emotion-focused coping because running relieves those negative emotions. And then finally, causes and effects. In that same example that I just gave you, the cause would be running and the effect would be relief of anxiety. Importantly, these kinds of relationships exist in all of your classes, right? They're absolutely present here in psychology, but they're everywhere else as well, in your history classes, your biology classes. So practicing recognizing these things here is going to help you in your other classes at school. In essence, what we are doing when we look for relationships is bypassing surface similarities and looking for similarities in underlying structure or in relationships. Now, I realize this is very, very hard. Let me give you another example of emotion-focused coping to help make this point. Something else that I like to do when I'm not feeling too good is to watch Bob's Burgers. If any of you have a comfort show that always makes you feel better, maybe you can kind of relate to this experience, right? So if I'm feeling sad or anxious or whatever, I can turn on Bob's Burgers and that makes me feel better. On the surface, those two situations, going for a run and watching Bob's Burgers, are pretty different, right? One of them involves sweating, the other one involves sitting on the comfy couch. And if we just stop there, looking at the surface, we might not realize that there's anything similar about those two situations. But if we look at the structure, we do see some similarity. Right? In both cases, I'm doing something, I'm engaging in an action to relieve negative emotions. Still, I realize this is extremely hard, especially for novices, for beginners in a domain. In fact, I actually did my dissertation on, in part, why this is so hard for novices in a domain and what professors like me can do to make this easier for you. Let's talk about a simple illustration of surface versus structural similarities. Imagine you are interested in why on earth college students are so stressed out, which you are. I don't know if you know that, but college students are very stressed out. You find 3 studies. 1, the effects of loneliness on stress. 2, the effects of stress on loneliness. And 3, the effects of boredom on stress. On the surface, all of these things are about stress. Perfect, right? You can read them all to help you answer your question about why college students are so stressed. But actually, that's not such a great idea, right? If we look at the structure of these 2 studies, or of these 3 studies, only 2 of them should be relevant to your question. Number 1 and number 3 have stress as the effect, and number 2 has stress as the cause. So if you're interested in why students are so stressed, you shouldn't care about number 2, right? You should be looking for the structural similarities for number 1 and number 3. Okay, so far I have been talking about analysis kind of broadly, and I've been giving you these sort of abstract examples of what analysis is and where it's useful. Now I want to move to a pretty rich, complex, real-life example that I personally have found it very important to understand and analyze. And that is the psychological disorder anorexia nervosa. So remember, you do need to have a why. You need to have a reason why you are interested in this analysis. Otherwise, we'll end up, otherwise there's no point to it, right? I will tell you that in a few minutes here. First, I want to talk about that overall structure that we're going to be embedding this, this idea in. The psychological concepts and relationships between them. Okay, so this is a preview from something that you will learn at the end of the course, but just in case y'all are not familiar with the diagnosis process of anorexia, I just wanted to show you what the diagnostic criteria are to give you a little bit more context for this last part of the lecture here. The first criteria is restriction of energy intake leading to low body weight. Importantly, there is no official weight cutoff. So there used to be a weight cutoff in older editions of the DSM where a person needed to have a specific BMI in order to be diagnosed with anorexia, but that is not the case anymore. The second criteria that clinicians will look for in making this diagnosis is an intense fear of gaining weight or consistent behavior that interferes with weight gain. So some patients will not admit out loud that they have a fear of gaining weight, but they will still engage in behaviors that interfere with gaining weight. So even though they say they're not afraid of gaining weight, they might still restrict or they might still exercise too much, which results in that criteria number 1, right? The restriction of, or that leads to low body weight. Individuals with anorexia are often plagued by a disturbed perception of their body weight, their body shape, and there is an excessive influence of their weight and shape on how they view themselves, on their self-esteem, right? So they believe that how they look is a necessary component of their self-evaluation, and if they don't look up to their own standards, their self-evaluation goes down, decreases. They also often don't recognize the seriousness of this issue because they have this disturbed perception of their body weight and their shape, right? So a person with anorexia might not recognize that they have a disorder. They might see themselves as overweight, even though they are the opposite, right? They're in fact underweight. One way that clinicians say this is that people with anorexia often lack insight. They don't know that they have a problem. Okay, so why? Why am I telling you about anorexia long before you're ever going to be tested on this material, right? This is something that'll show up on your final exam, but not on your midterm. This is kind of a difficult lecture for me to give you. Last year, one of my very close friends disclosed to me that she had been diagnosed with and treated for anorexia. So this is something that matters a great deal to me personally. I want to know everything that I can about what my friend is going through and how I can best support her. So I turned to what I know about psychology and my analysis skills to help me better understand this situation and to be a supportive friend. I want to give you a few more facts about anorexia to, again, give more context to this situation, all the things that kind of entered into my calculus when I was, thinking about what to do in this situation. As I'm sure you are already aware, anorexia is a very serious mental illness. It has a lifetime prevalence of about 1%, meaning in their lifetime, about 1% of US adults will be diagnosed with anorexia. But this is probably an underestimate because lots of the people that have the behavioral symptoms of anorexia don't have the stereotypical body that people with anorexia have in our cultural mindset, right? So people that started off at a higher weight and exhibit all of the behavioral symptoms of anorexia might not be diagnosed using the criteria from the DSM. It is also underdiagnosed in men, importantly. So there is a host of physiological issues associated with anorexia. If you are a woman, you might stop getting your period, you might stop menstruating. This is called amenorrhea. And that's a big problem because it can lead to low bone density. In women, estrogen is something really important to help build strong bones. And if you're not menstruating, that's an indication that your body is not producing enough estrogen, and it could weaken your bones. So my friend, she is, under 30, and she currently has osteopenia, which is the precursor to osteoporosis. This is something that she's going to have to deal with for the rest of her life because she spent some key years of her younger life being malnourished. There is also lots of gastrointestinal issues, bloating, and other distress. In severe cases, organ and cardiac damage can happen. Anorexia also has a high comorbidity with other psychiatric diagnoses. So that means very frequently when people have this diagnosis of anorexia, they have at least one other psychological diagnosis, commonly anxiety and depression. The prognosis or the recovery for or the disease progression for anorexia is particularly poor. On average, less than half of people that have this diagnosis recover. 1/3 of the people with this diagnosis have what is called a varied course, which means that some of the symptoms go away, but not all of them. So they'll maybe regain some of the weight, but they still have the psychological problems of basing too much of their self-worth and self-evaluation on what their body looks like. 20% of people with this diagnosis remain chronically ill, meaning there's pretty much no recovery at all. And relapse rates are quite high after people regain weight in an inpatient setting. Last bummer thing about the prognosis for anorexia is that there have been virtually no pharmacological or medication interventions that have been shown to help people with anorexia. There's some research suggesting that antidepressants might be helpful for people with bulimia, but there's been no such work suggesting this stuff works for anorexia. Some suggestions that cognitive behavioral therapy is moderately successful, but it's very hard to do research with this population. Remember on the last slide, I talked about how these individuals often have poor insight, right? So they don't see that they have a problem, so they're going maybe less likely to engage with a therapeutic relationship to try and fix this problem that they don't think they have. One, I think, bright light in this poor prognosis for anorexia in general is that the prognosis is better for adolescents. So if this disorder is caught early on, adolescents have a much higher chance of recovering fully from the disorder. And then finally, one of the most disturbing things that I learned about anorexia when I heard about my friend's diagnosis is that this disorder has the highest mortality rate among psychiatric disorders. After 10 years, between 5 and 6% of people that have a diagnosis of anorexia will be dead. And this comes from a few sources. The malnourishment is a big one. And importantly, suicide risk is quite high for people with anorexia. I think in that paper that I'm citing there, 1 out of every 5 died by suicide after those 10 years had, so of that 5 to 6%, 1 out of every 5 people in that 5 to 6% that had died by suicide. Oof, that was a bit of a mouthful there. But anyway, so as you can see, hard for me to talk about, but I think it's important. Since this diagnosis, I've talked to my friend a lot, and she has agreed to let me use her story to tell you about why it's so important for you to learn how to analyze. I'm going to call her Jenny in the following slides. That is not her name, that is a pseudonym, but that's the one that we've agreed on to protect her anonymity. All right, so psychology and anorexia. Let's take some concepts from psychology and relate them to Jenny's experience with anorexia. So why am I doing this, right? Well, understanding this disorder better and how it operates in a person's life can actually help you get a better handle on treatment, right? If I can better understand why she developed the disorder, maybe we can work those things into her treatment plan. We're going to connect this to some ideas from conditioning and learning. Most prominently, operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So let's start with operant conditioning. When Jenny first started losing weight, people told her she looked good. She said people at the gym complimented her on her physique. This is positive reinforcement, right? You're adding something good to this person's life. And you know by now what operant conditioning means, right? You're associating this behavior of weight loss with the consequence of that behavior. I get complimented. So what does that do, right? You're going to do that behavior more. You're going to continue that weight loss. There were also several examples of negative reinforcement in Jenny's life. She told me that she first started restricting her caloric intake when she was having a really difficult time at work. Everything in her work life felt out of her control, and she felt like she didn't have a lot of agency. So she focused on the one thing she could control, her eating, right? Restricting her caloric intake made her feel like she was in control of her life. So in that small way, it reduced some of the anxiety that she felt about everything else, because she could control this one thing. Later, after she had already developed some of these habits of restricting, Jenny told me that sometimes eating or being in situations where she was expected to eat, like out with friends for dinner, that made her anxious. So she would avoid those situations. Avoiding those situations made her feel better, right? And so what do we have here? Again, more reinforcement in both of these cases. If restricting your eating makes you feel better, you're going to keep doing that restriction. That's reinforcement. If eating makes you anxious and avoiding eating makes you feel better, you're going to keep avoiding. On the surface, these two examples might look a little bit different from one another, right? One is kind of a macro, big idea. Her whole life felt out of control, so she focused on the things she could control. And then this other example of eating making you anxious, that's a very situational, small-scale thing. But again, I want to push you to look for structural similarities. These are both examples of emotion-focused coping, where Jenny was doing something that did not at all address the underlying problems that she was experiencing, but she was doing some kind of behavior to make her emotions feel better, to alleviate some kind of psychological distress. There's also a role for positive punishment, right? So remember, punishment means that the behavior in question is going to decrease because there's a bad consequence associated with it. Often Jenny would feel sick after eating. So, if you feel sick after eating, what are you going to do? You're going to eat less. So taking all of these things together, her therapist made some recommendations for Jenny's treatment. One thing that her therapist recommended was to try to restructure the contingencies around mealtimes. Mealtimes were not rewarding for Jenny, right? They made her anxious, and often she felt punishment after eating because her stomach was upset. So her therapist tried to have Jenny make some behavioral changes to make these mealtimes more rewarding. For example, she started cooking meals with her boyfriend. She started eating meals with her boyfriend and being sure to talk to him about her day during those meals to make that entire experience reinforcing. Now I want to share an example of classical conditioning from Jenny's life. So this requires a short story before I can tell you how it works. So Jenny told me that one day she got home from the gym and before she went up into the shower, she told her boyfriend, she was like, you know what? I could actually go for some mac and cheese today. And in her mind, what she was thinking of was those like little Kraft mac and cheese cups that have just like a cup of mac and cheese. They're not very caloric. And for Jenny, they were a safe food. She went up, took her shower, and when she came back down from her shower, she saw her boyfriend at the stove making mac and cheese from scratch. She told me that she froze. She felt completely overwhelmed and flooded with anxiety at the sight of all of the butter and the cheese and the milk and everything that was going into the cooking of this meal. In other words, she had not a full panic attack, but close to a panic response, a huge fear, anxiety response. This is because of classical conditioning. Now, I can't generalize from my single friend that has an experience with anorexia, but she's talked to a couple other people that have this disorder, and she said that it is kind of common that people with anorexia have what are called fear foods. So for whatever reason, some foods that people with anorexia have a lot of trouble eating, or foods that they associate with weight gain that are anxiety provoking. So for Jenny, those fear foods were things like butter, cheese, and foods like that. I think actually the example that I just gave you is higher order conditioning, not just straight classical conditioning. Right? So remember, higher order conditioning is 2 rounds of classical conditioning chained back to back. For an average person that does not have anorexia, weight gain is not an unconditioned stimulus that leads to the unconditioned response of anxiety and fear. But this is automatic for people that have anorexia, right? That is a part of the diagnosis. If you meet that criteria, for you, gaining weight is frightening, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is the idea of weight gain, and the response is anxiety and fear. Now, the problem for Jenny was that this unconditioned stimulus of weight gain was paired to a fear food, to mac and cheese, right? So now, mac and cheese alone is enough to elicit that fear response, the anxiety, the fear, the fight or flight response that she had. So the implications for treatment here, her therapist, after Jenny told her therapist about this incident, her therapist recommended basically counter conditioning, right? Eat a little bit of mac and cheese today and teach your body, oh, you're not going to gain weight immediately after you eat some mac and cheese. And even if you do, you're not going to die, right? Then eat a little bit more, then eat a little bit more, until she eventually was able to have a small serving of mac and cheese without having this anxiety response. And now finally, this slide is hard for me, but I'm gonna go forward with it. Why didn't I notice? I think there are several reasons why I didn't notice. I think a big one is confirmation bias. If you live in the US or have lived in the US and had access to Western culture for a long time, you probably have a stereotype in your head of what someone with anorexia looks like, right? If it's anything like mine, your stereotype of anorexia looks like basically a model, right? Someone who is very tall, very thin, almost emaciated. And this is a disorder that I thought really only plagued people like in the fashion industry. Jenny does not look like that at all. She's an athlete. This entire time while she was suffering from this diagnosis, she was exercising. She's like lean, she's strong looking kind of, right? She doesn't look like the stereotype of anorexia. Confirmation bias means you're going to selectively notice information that confirms what you already believe and not notice information that goes against that belief. Because Jenny did not fit my stereotype of what someone with anorexia looks like, I was less likely to notice. This is also something that is really important to consider when we talk about the rise of what therapists are now calling, or what the field is now calling atypical anorexia. I don't love this term, but this is the term that we have started using to refer to people that start off at a higher weight and exhibit all of the problems that are associated with anorexia, but don't have the extremely low body weight that is stereotypically associated with anorexia. So I think with the rise of so-called atypical anorexia, it is extremely important for everyone to be on the lookout for confirmation bias in this area. The last concept that I want to bring up here is something from the perception chapter called the difference threshold. The difference threshold is the smallest change that you can make to a stimulus where you notice the difference. You notice a change has been made. So Jenny said that she lost weight pretty steadily, and she wasn't a big person to begin with, but she lost, about a pound every 2 to 3 weeks, and that was below my just noticeable difference, right? Like it was too slow for me to notice gradually while it was happening. When she showed me pictures of what she looked like before and when she was at her smallest weight, the difference was huge. I mean, it hurt me to see my friend suffering like that, but because of the weight loss being below my difference threshold, I didn't notice. And finally, in case you are not convinced that these thinking skills that we're talking about are crucial, I want you to think about what it must have been like for Jenny's therapist to meet her for the first time. Each clinician should have read the DSM, like they know the diagnoses in there, but it's not enough to just remember and understand those diagnoses. You need to be able to apply them, right? You need to be able to apply each symptom to a brand new individual person. And as I just showed you, analysis is crucial in being able to discover what is the relationship between this person's symptoms. How does her fear of gaining weight cause the effect of her restriction of her energy intake, right? That is extremely important for the therapist. Her therapist also needed to use analysis to ask questions about why she developed anorexia and how are those factors related to and connected to her treatment. She also had to create a treatment plan, right? So Jenny is currently receiving cognitive behavioral therapy with some elements of mindfulness interventions thrown in, right? So her therapist had to adapt this treatment plan based on whether or not it was working. This is evaluation. She also sees a dietitian, right? That was something else that was added into this treatment plan. All right. Last thing here, I know this was a long one. I hope that example was interesting to you and that it convinced you that analysis can help you in your personal life, but it might not be exactly relevant to each and every one of you, right? So now I'll share something that I guarantee is relevant to you, because exam essay questions, like you will have on your midterm, often involve analysis and sometimes more. For example, let's say you get a question on some psychology midterm where your professor asks you to, describe a single situation that has elements of both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If that happened, did you see that wink? If that happened, you have to do analysis, right? You got to connect the concepts in that question to your real life, as you've been doing all along. And you need to understand the difference between classical and operant conditioning. How are those two things similar? How are they different? Final note here, if you see this question, I'll wink again, there will be more guidance because I know it is a little bit of a complex idea here. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching this lecture video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.